But first, a couple of Aussie legends died over the past few days. Andrew Peacock and Izzy Lieberman. Izzy Lieberman was the great Jewish Australian conservative commentator, and I was honoured to have had some correspondence with Izzy after he wrote to me thanking me for some of my commentary here on Outsiders and in The Spectator Australia. Melanie Phillips wrote this week. The death in Jerusalem of Izzy Lieberman at the age of 86 has robbed the Jewish world of one of its towering figures at a time when it is particularly ill-equipped for such a loss. Izzy Lieberman sent out a regular email, which always made for compulsive reading. 2018, he pointed out, however, recent decades, the far left has become viciously anti-Israeli, even supporting terrorist groups like Hamas and Hezbollah, and depicting Israel as an imperialist occupier. This trend reached a climax, Izzy wrote, under US President Barack Obama, who made overtures to the Iranians, that's back again, and treated Israel politically as a rogue state. Yet, Izzy wrote, barely a single mainstream Jewish leader had the courage to stand up and protest Obama's bias against Israel and his constant bracketing of Israeli defensive actions as morally equivalent to the actions of terrorists. Despite this, Izzy lamented, American Jews were among Obama's greatest supporters. Here is Izzy Lieberman talking about the insidious boycott, divest and sanctions movement, BDS, promoted around the world by people like Roger Waters, hardcore Greens, and many on the mainstream left.
If anything reflects anti-Semitism, it's the BDS movement, because Israel is singled out. And Israel is a unique country. It's like an oasis here in a sea of barbarism. And we are being kind of isolated by people who claim to be concerned about human rights. These people are turning towards Israel and ignoring the mayhem and the millions of people who have been displaced and killed around them and concentrating on the Jews. This, to me, is quite open anti-Semitism.
What Izzy Lieberman must have made of the past few months under Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, I hate to think. And then on Friday came the sad news that Andrew Peacock had died, aged 82. I was lucky to work very briefly with Andrew Peacock a long time ago when I made some rather lame TV ads for the Liberal Party in the 1990 election. Andrew was a very funny bloke in private, but his minders despaired at how wooden he always appeared in front of the camera. So, as a young up-and-coming TV director, I had just finished filming some ads for Smith's Chips. You remember the gobbledoc, that weird little furry creature running around going, chippies? Yes, that was some of my handiwork. And the creative director at the ad agency said, Chippies said, well, Rowan, if you can make a gobbledoc look natural in front of the camera, you can probably do the same for Andrew Peacock. And so I got the job. We spent a week filming the ads in and around Sydney, and it was a lot of fun. Andrew Peacock had a great sense of larrikin humour, and I was astonished how brilliantly he joked around with everyone, completely at odds with his reputation as the aloof colt from Kooyong. When he was chatting to everyday blue-collar Aussies, he'd tell these totally politically incorrect, risque gags to all and sundry, including the women who tended to laugh the loudest. Jokes that nowadays no politician would dare utter anywhere near a microphone or even in private. Unfortunately, the minders wouldn't let us use any of the gags in the ads. Peacock actually won 50.1% of the two-party vote in that election, but it wasn't enough after preferences and Bob Hawke remained PM. I always thought that if we'd actually run those raunchy outtakes, Peacock might have won. But in memory of Andrew Peacock, here's one of those ads that sadly, I suspect, stole the election from under his nose.
There are questions that just have to be answered.
I'm often asked, what can we do about the people who won't even try to get a job? With the Liberals, there'll be 9 months to find a job before the dole cuts out, and that's fair. Instead of going on the dole, school and university leavers will get a job search allowance. Tough questions need tough answers. What a fair go. The answer is Liberal.
The answer is Liberal. Authorised by Tony Eggleton, Liberal Party, Canberra.
Of course, as some Labor wag, Keating probably quipped, if the answer is Liberal, it must be a pretty stupid question. But think about this. If the ads had been better and Peacock had won that election, we would never have had the eventual return Lazarus with a triple bypass of John Howard, one of our greatest prime ministers. So I guess you'd have to admit we might never have had those golden Howard years if it weren't for me and the gobbledoc.
Gobbledoc arrived from the potato planet. He's learned a very important lesson. Not all chips are as fresh, are as crisp, are as delicious as... Smith's Crisps, the original and best.
They don't make them like that anymore. One of the great tussles of the Bob Hawke years, when John Howard was still Liberal Party leader, was over the Australia card. Most Aussies were horrified by the idea of a mandatory identity card, particularly people who had fled from communist regimes. Interestingly, the idea was finally abandoned after the brilliant National Senator John Stone torpedoed it in the Senate. Well, now there's a new threat looming that makes the Australia card look like a complimentary ticket to a libertarian orgy. It's lurking there in the corridors of the medical bureaucracies, and it's now being hinted at by our supposedly Liberal Prime Minister. It's the digital vaccine passport. This week, the Prime Minister suggested that Australians may soon be able to travel overseas and return home without going into hotel quarantine if they are vaccinated against COVID-19. In other words, special treatment for those who can show they've had the vaccine. Now, what's wrong with that, you may well ask? And in fairness, in and of itself, it makes perfect sense. But it's the bigger principle that we must focus on. In the US, some states like New York and California are linking individual freedoms to a digital vaccine passport. And in the UK, the Boris Johnson government is in all sorts of trouble with not only Conservatives, but more importantly, pub beer-drinking blue workers and pub goers by suggesting you might need to have a vaccine passport even to get into your local pub. An absolute heresy in beer-loving Britain. But that is the underlying point. Once you introduce a vaccine passport for, say, travel, where does it stop? How quickly would it become required for shopping, banking, going to the theatre? Well, everything and anything, really. And then what happens when you choose not to have one? You're an instant pariah, an outcast from society. That is how communism and totalitarianism work, not freedom. Indeed, last week, the idea of specifically linking every individual freedom to a digital vaccine passport was being pushed aggressively by CNN's Dr. Leanna Wen.
We need to make it clear to them that the vaccine is the ticket back to pre-pandemic life. And the window to do that is really narrowing. I mean, you were mentioning, Chris, about how all these states are reopening. They're reopening at 100%. And we have a very narrow window to tie reopening policy to vaccination status.
A vaccine passport will allow governments to decide who can travel where, who can buy what, who can earn what, or even who gets what jobs. You heard the woman. Tie the vaccine to personal freedoms, there's only a narrow window. Only allow people to return to a normal life if they can show they've been vaccinated. If there's one thing we learnt from the past 12 months, it's how easily our police, particularly in authoritarian left-wing states like Victoria and Queensland, can so easily become quasi-fascists. While to their eternal shame, the federal government and the Prime Minister sat on their hands and said absolutely nothing. Every aspect of human liberty, freedom of expression, freedom of movement, freedom of opportunity and personal choice and individuality, they're all threatened permanently and perhaps irrevocably by a digital vaccine passport. So let's be clear, I have no problem with taking any vaccine, take as many as you like, so long as I know what the risks are and more importantly, so long as it is my choice to do so, not someone else's. Coercion through the workplace or restricting the liberties of those who choose not to take the vaccine is as obscene as it is wrong. Any attempt at a mandatory vaccination program or any kind of coercion leading to some weird Chinese-style social credit system of a vaccine passport that limits your freedoms must be resisted at all costs. It's called freedom, and that is what our ancestors gave their lives for. On a lighter note, at least some people are starting to protest against the assaults on freedom. Why? The lockdowns and masks have even forced Mick Jagger to get out and write his first decent rock song in ages. If the Stones can't take the mickey out of these mandatory measures, who can?
It's a pretty mask, but